Chapter 1.
Wilbur, why did you assault Yvonne?
Wilbur Penn responded calmly to the Willow's interrogations.
Yvonne came home drunk late at night with her clothes all messy. I was just helping her to bed so she could rest, but you accused me of assaulting her. Also, she's my wife. How is that assault?
It's assault if violence was used, even if you're husband and wife.
Roared Wilbur's father-in-law, Jackson Willow. His mother-in-law, Miranda Wester, chimed in as well.
That's right. You're getting a divorce today, and you're leaving with nothing.
Wilbur's brows furrowed so hard that they knitted together. Just then, the younger sister, Chelsea Willow, said,
Dad, Mom, what are you guys doing? If it hadn't been for Wilbur giving us $50 million back then, we wouldn't have moved on from being regular folks to becoming billionaires with a booming supermarket business right now. Have you forgotten what Wilbur has done for us?
Wilbur's wife, Yvonne, roared.
Shush, you. It's true that he gave us $50 million, but he hasn't done anything in the past 3 years other than lazing around. We built the Willow Empire on our own. He has nothing to do with it.
Chelsea was just about to retaliate when her father said,
There's nothing more for you to say. They're getting a divorce for sure.
Chelsea bit her lip and sighed. Wilbur shook his head. It had been 3 years. Apart from Chelsea, every other member of the Willows had let him down.
I'll think about it,
said Wilbur as he returned to his room. Wilbur walked into the shower after taking off his clothes. His back was exposed, showing a ferocious-looking dragon head covering most of his back. It was not a tattoo but a mark that he bore ever since he was born. He had also gotten strange energy from the mark. Ever since that day, he changed his name to Trevor Penn, fighting with his life on the line overseas, and made his mark in history by forming the legendary Abyss Mercenaries. He got tired of all the bloodshed many years later and dispersed the mercenaries once he made enough money. Only a few executives stayed behind, who used their riches to form the Cape Consortium. They hired the best people from Waller Street to run it, making investments around the world and becoming one of the best consortiums in the world. Wilbur himself had returned to Seacher Town. He picked up his old name of Wilbur once more and chose to get married to his fiancée Yvonne Willow. He was prepared to retire his old identity and live the rest of his life in the suburbs. At first, the Willows were overjoyed to get those $50 million from him. They practically treated Wilbur like a king. Yet as time passed, the Willows grew stronger financially, and they began to change how they treated him. It was to the point where they were trying to chase him out and leave him with nothing. Wilbur stood under the cold water as his expression turned cold. It was not that he refused to leave the Willows, but that Wilbur's grandfather was a benefactor of Yvonne's grandfather in the past. Wilbur's grandfather's dying wish was for him to marry into the Willows to repay that favor. Both their grandfathers had promised the arranged marriage early on. Wilbur went through with the marriage, but the Willows were getting sick of him. So be it. Since that was the case, he would just leave. Was there any point in suffering like this? He would live in the mountains and focus on cultivating for good. That would be better anyways. Upon making his mind up, Wilbur walked out of the bathroom. He was just about to get dressed when Chelsea opened the room's door and walked right in.
Oops, what are you doing? Put on your clothes.
Chelsea cried out in shock, closing the door hurriedly. Wilbur scrambled into his clothes, his face flushing. It was embarrassing to have Chelsea see all of him.
I'm done. You can come in now,
Wilbur said while trying his best to keep a calm tone. Chelsea opened the door by a crack, only going in after she made sure that Wilbur was dressed. The two of them sat on the couch. Chelsea was blushing.
Wilbur, I know this is hard for you, but you don't need to worry. I'm not going to let you to get divorced. The Willows would be nowhere without you. I won't forget that.
Silly girl, there's no good in forcing things that aren't meant to be. You don't have to care about this anymore,
Wilbur replied. Chelsea was the only person in the Willow family who had shown Wilbur any warmth. She was the only one who still had a pure heart, which was truly hard to find. Yet Chelsea said,
This is something I care about. Just ignore them. They can't force you to get divorced as long as you don't consent to it. Listen to me.
All right, I understand. You should go to work now.
Wilbur said with a smile. Chelsea glanced at her watch.
I'll make a move now. Remember what I said.
Chelsea only got up after seeing Wilbur nod. Wilbur smiled. He smoked a cigarette before getting up to go downstairs. Only Yvonne and his in-laws were there.
Are you not going to work today?
Wilbur asked. The Willow family had built an empire for themselves, and everyone was busy all the time. What was going on? Yvonne scoffed coldly.
We're having guests today, and we're preparing for it.
Wilbur glanced at the maids who were hard at work. He was about to say something when the front door opened.
Oh my, you're here, Mr. Woods. Please have a seat.
Jackson and Miranda welcomed the man at the door at once, helping him over to the sofa. Yvonne walked over to him as well, sitting down right next to him and smiled warmly at him. Wilbur frowned. He sat by the side and smoked a cigarette. The other four chatted away happily, completely ignoring Wilbur's presence. Wilbur himself did not say anything, wanting to see what they were playing at. After talking for some time, Mr. Woods turned around all of a sudden to address Wilbur.
You must be Mr. Wilbur Penn.
Wilbur smiled lightly.
Yes, and how should I address you?
I'm Blake Woods, CEO of Woods Corporate.
Blake was all smiles as well. Wilbur nodded. His face was devoid of emotion.
I've heard about you.
I heard that you've been married to Yvonne for 3 years, but haven't been intimate at all. Is this true?
Blake asked shamelessly. Wilbur nodded.
Yes.
He had reached an important point in cultivating back then and needed to maintain an air of purity. That was why he had not shared a room with Yvonne. However, after he had passed that point, Yvonne had already lost feelings for him. He did not force anything either, and thus the two had merely remained married in name only. Blake broke out laughing at those words.
Yvonne was telling me that last night, and I couldn't even believe it. But I guess it's true. How were you able to resist a beauty like her? Could it be that you're lacking in a certain aspect?
Wilbur smirked as he sensed Blake's arrogant tone but remained calm.
You were the one drinking with her last night? Did she tell you everything?
That's right. We talked long and late into the night. It's such a pity that we only met each other this late in our lives. It truly is a shame for such a good person to end up with a loser like you. God bless her.
Blake shook his head. Wilbur smirked coldly.
Seems like you've got it all figured out, and you're just waiting for me to get lost, aren't you?
Blake replied smugly.
I'll be honest with you. Woods Corporate is worth billions right now. We've also just connected with the Cape consortium, and they're going to invest another $5 billion in us. My company's growing by the second. Yvonne's only going to be happy with me. What can you give her?
Cape Consortium is in Town?
Wilbur asked in surprise. He rarely questioned or meddled in the consortium's finances and had no idea that they had expanded all the way here. Chapter 2. Blake shook his head at once.
God, you're useless. Top dogs like the Cape consortium make the headlines no matter what they do. How could you not know about this? You really are garbage.
He's just a lazy freeloader. There's no point saying all that to him.
Miranda glared at Wilbur, her gaze one of disdain. Jackson glowered at Wilbur as well.
You don't know how to do anything but eat and sleep. It's best that you get lost and stop embarrassing us.
Wilbur was so angered that a laugh escaped him. Who knows how they would react if they were to find out who he really was? Thankfully, he had hidden his real identity at the time, otherwise he would have never seen their true colors. Just then, the maids began setting up the table with an assortment of lavish dishes. A brief moment later, Jackson said,
Mr. Woods, please join us for lunch.
Oh, sure.
Blake got up slowly. Yvonne held him by the arm as they made their way to the dining table. Wilbur glanced at the time.
It's barely 10 o'clock. Isn't it a little too early for lunch?
You don't know anything. Mr. Woods is our guest of honor. He deserves only the best from us.
Jackson roared back angrily. Miranda's expression was mocking as well.
You've got no place here. Get some food from the kitchen if you want to eat.
Yvonne did not care for Wilbur at all either, clutching onto Blake so tightly that the two were nearly one. Wilbur smirked coldly. It was clear that Yvonne was giving him a hard time on purpose so that he would propose a divorce out of humiliation and then leave with nothing. He was planning to leave with nothing, but that changed his mind. Wilbur still wanted to give them one last test, so he said slowly,
I know what you're trying to do. How about this? You give me back the $5 million I gave you back then, and we'll call it even. How's that?
Are you joking?
Miranda flared up in anger at once.
Did you expect to be living with us for the past 3 years for free? My daughter's going to have to remarry because of you. Doesn't she deserve compensation for that as well? We're giving you an easy way out by not asking you for any more money. How dare you ask for money from us?
Jackson smirked coldly as well.
The Willows have been nothing but kind to you. Know your place.
Wilbur, it's good to know when to back down. Mr. Woods and I are meant to be. Do you really want us to demonstrate how much more compatible we are for you to leave?
Yvonne said shamelessly. Wilbur was thoroughly disappointed. Sure enough, this world was not a fair one. There were many sides to every person. His thorough disappointment led to a thorough change of plans. He was not in a rush to get divorced anymore. He was going to build his own business empire in Dasha, which would be a piece of cake for him. He wanted to see the looks on the Willows and Mr. Wood's faces when that time came.
Enjoy your lunch. I'm going to get some rest.
Wilbur said, then turned around to go upstairs. Yvonne said,
Forget him, Mr. Woods. Let's eat.
As she spoke, she put a spoonful of food up to Blake's mouth. Wilbur returned to his room, smirking as he pulled out his phone and called a number. A brief moment later, the call went through, and a girl's voice could be heard.
Boss, you finally remembered us.
That lady used to be where he got his information from. Her name was Layla Chesler, a genius hacker and elite sniper. At the moment, she was based in one of Cape Consortium's largest overseas branches.
Layla, is the Cape Consortium coming to Town?
Wilbur got straight to the point.
Yes, the others decided it. You told us that we would only be in charge of security and not meddle with operations.
Great. Tell me the address, and get me in touch with the person in charge. Tell them I'd like to meet with them for a talk. Tell them to wait for me.
Yes, boss. All the information will be sent to your phone at once. We'll let the person in charge know.
Wilbur hung up the call, pausing for a second before heading outside. As he walked past the living room, Yvonne asked,
Where are you going?
I have some stuff to do.
Wilbur said calmly. Yvonne chuckled.
What could you possibly have to do? That's hilarious. Pack your bags and get lost.
Wilbur smiled faintly without retaliating. Blake and the Willows were going to pay for humiliating him like this eventually. He would just let them act out for a little while longer. Without saying anything else, Wilbur walked out of the Willow household. Over at the headquarters of Cape Consortium's Town branch, CEO Faye sat in her office on the top floor of the company. She was a nervous wreck. She had been notified that the real boss of Cape Consortium was there to have a talk with her. She had only found out that day itself that the boss of such a massive and powerful consortium was in Town and was looking to have a chat with her. She had a PhD in finance and was considered intelligent and knowledgeable. However, meeting up with big figures like this instilled a sense of worry in her chest. That was a world-class boss she was going to see. She informed the front desk as soon as she had gotten the call and checked herself in the mirror over and over again before making sure that everything was in place. With that, the agonizing process of waiting began. Just then, Wilbur was done at the front desk and was making his way up in the elevator to Faye's office. The secretary at the door stood up at once to ask who he was. Upon finding out, she hurried to send him to the office. Faye got to her feet at once upon noticing someone entering, stopping in place in confusion at once. The man before her looked like he was in his 20s. He had chiseled features and was quite the looker. There was no way he was the big boss behind Cape Consortium. No one this young would own this much money.
You are?
Faye still asked carefully.
My name is Wilbur Penn.
As he said that, he sat down on the couch in a graceless swoop. Faye was dumbfounded. How could this be? Holding back her shock, she served up tea personally before bowing to him.
It's a pleasure to meet you, boss.
Wilbur looked Faye up and down. She was a beautiful woman who looked to be in her 30s, and it was clear that she knew what she was doing. Clad in formal attire, she radiated the enticing aura of a mature woman. Wilbur's gaze made Faye's heart race, but she remained in place without moving an inch. Quickly enough, Wilbur looked away and asked,
I heard that you were going to invest in Woods Corporate. Is that right?
Faye racked her brains quickly to make sure before nodding.
Yes, boss.
Very well. I need you to do something. Strip Woods Corporate of their power within a week and have Cape Consortium gain full control over them. Can you do that?
Faye's expression turned awkward. It was easy to take control of Wood's corporate. Cape Consortium's investment was big enough for them to be considered the major shareholder. However, to do that within a week would be very challenging. Yet upon pondering briefly, she said at once,
All right, boss, I'll get it done.
what kind of professional would she be if she let her boss down in the first meeting? Wilbur nodded in satisfaction.
Great. That's all for now. I'll have other tasks for you in the future. Do your best. There's no need to see me out. I'd like to keep my identity a secret.
After saying that, Wilbur got up to leave. Faye stood where she was in a daze, not daring to go against what she had been told. However, upon opening the door, a man rushed in head first and collided with Wilbur. The man raised his head and saw who he was before shouting,
Are you blind? Watch where you're going.
Chapter 3.
What did you say?
Wilbur's expression turned cold. How dare this person be so rude after running into him? The man scoffed coldly.
Which department are you from, and what's your name?
Likewise, which department are you from, and what's your name?
Wilbur responded coldly. The man said proudly,
I'm Cape Consortium's vice president, Stanley Lowes. Do you work here?
You could say that.
Wilbur responded calmly. Stanley sneered.
You're fired. Get out right now.
Wilbur smiled in annoyance and disbelief.
You're firing someone just like that?
What are you going to do about it? I can fire you if I want to.
Stanley's expression was nothing but condescending. Wilbur said slowly,
Oh my, a man of power.
The main overseas branch sent me, the vice president of the Carden Province branch, to supervise things around here. Even Miss Faye Eve here works under me, let alone someone like you.
Stanley stared down at Wilbur. Wilbur frowned. Just then, Faye opened the door and saw Stanley.
What's going on here?
Miss Eve, this guy just ran into me and didn't even apologize. I'm going to fire him. He's too rude and unprofessional to work here.
Stanley announced confidently. Faye walked up and gave Stanley a slap across his face. The crisp sound rang through the air, leaving Stanley in a daze.
What the hell are you doing, Miss Eve?
Stanley roared. Faye sneered coldly.
You're fired. Get lost.
What?
Stanley stared at Faye in disbelief, pausing briefly before returning to his senses.
You have no right to fire me. I was sent from the headquarters.
Is that so?
Faye took out her phone and made a call to the overseas department. A second later, she handed the phone to Stanley.
Answer it.
A chill ran down Stanley's spine as he answered the call. He began to shiver, trembling as he held the phone, unable to get a word out. Faye snatched the phone back from him.
Can you get lost now?
Miss Eve, let me explain.
Stanley was scared out of his wits. The headquarters was nothing but strict to him just now, not only firing him but also ordering him to be punished when he returned. He knew how ruthless the people in charge of security and discipline were, and he might just end up half dead. Yet all Faye said was,
You can explain to headquarters all you want. Get lost now.
Stanley knew that he had lost all hope then. The thought of what he was going to face flashed through his mind, and his body jerked harshly before passing out from shock. Wilbur frowned.
What the hell was he doing? Why was he even hired in the first place?
I'm sorry, boss. Faye bowed apologetically. Wilbur sighed.
It's not your fault.
After saying that, he left. Faye stared at Wilbur's retreating figure. She let out a sigh, wiping away the sweat on her brow. Wilbur had a brief meal, then called a cab to go home. It was noon when he got back. Yvonne and Blake were entwined in a passionate embrace in the living room, flirting and laughing. Wilbur looked around him and saw that his in-laws were nowhere to be seen. They must have left conveniently. Paying them no mind, Wilbur went to his room. Stop! Yvonne called out to him loudly. Wilbur stopped in his tracks and looked at Yvonne. Yvonne got up, walked up to Wilbur, and mocked him. You really are a sorry excuse of a man. Are you really not going to do anything even when you see your own wife in someone else's arms? I have my ways to show that I'm a man. I don't think you even see me as human now, though, Wilbur said quietly. How dare you talk back to me? Yvonne flared up in outrage and swung a palm at Wilbur's face. However, Wilbur caught her by the wrist in one swift motion, making Yvonne cry out in pain. Blake rushed over at once, crying out loudly, "Let Yvonne go." Wilbur smiled lightly but made no move to let go. Blake flared up in outrage, sending a punch at Wilbur's face. Wilbur's leg kicked out at lightning speed, and the very next moment, Blake was lying on the ground crying out in pain. It was only then that Wilbur let go of Yvonne. She stumbled a few steps back, clutching her wrist in pain. Wilbur stared at the both of them coldly. "Don't try getting violent with me. You'll be the one suffering instead." Blake struggled to get to his feet. He was about to shout at Wilbur when his phone rang. He took it out to take a look and picked it up at once. A moment later, he ended the call with a look of glee on his face, as if he had forgotten the pain completely. "Yvonne, we'll get back at him later. Cape Consortium's going to sign the agreement with me. I'm going to the office to get some work done. You should come too." Yvonne nodded at that. She glowered at Wilbur ferociously before turning to Blake. "All right. We'll do as you say. Let's settle work first." Blake looked at Wilbur, his tone venomous. "Just you wait. We're not done yet." "I'll be waiting then." Wilbur smiled. Blake sneered coldly, paying Wilbur no heed as he left with Yvonne in a hurry. The $5 billion were a big deal to him, and he had to get it. Wilbur could not help but let out a chuckle as the pair left. "What a good show this is going to be. I wonder what you'll look like when the curtains are raised," Wilbur mumbled to himself, returning to his room. Blake, on the other hand, raced to Cape Consortium at once and entered Faye's office. Faye sat at her desk as Blake entered with a placating smile and endless greetings. "Have a seat," Faye said in a polite tone while smiling. Blake sat down at once, and Faye took out a stack of files before placing them in front of Blake. "We've looked through your finances and approved them, Mr. Woods. Once you sign this, we'll send $5 billion to your company account." Blake was overjoyed, flipping the files open to take a look at them. A moment later, his expression changed to shock as he said, "Miss Eve, has there been a mistake? Why are you asking for so many people to be let into our board of directors?" Faye smiled and replied, "To supervise the use of funds. We're talking about $5 billion here. What if something happens with no one around to keep track of it? How are you going to pay us back?" "Yes, but this is too many people, isn't it?" Blake stared at the document, his heart filled with reluctance. Shareholders' percentage aside, the ratio of the board of directors would be tipped over, with Cape Consortium having more members than Woods Corporate. Cape Consortium could very well kick Stanley out of the board of directors if they wanted to. Faye shifted in her seat, leaning forward with an intimidating presence. "Mr. Woods, you should know this as well as I do. Your company does have a bright future, but you've been moving a little too fast, and your chain of capital is now broken. Only Cape Consortium is financially capable and powerful enough to help Woods Corporate toward the right path. Besides, we're the Cape Consortium. Why would we go out of our way to get a company as small as yours? You're overthinking things." Blake was stuck in a dilemma. It was true that Woods Corporate's chain of capital was broken, and they were in a dire situation. That was why he had asked for help from Cape Consortium and also got in touch with Yvonne. He needed a backup plan. If the Cape Consortium refused to help him, he would marry Yvonne and use the Willow's finances to get him through this tough time before usurping the Willows altogether. However, the Willow's assets would only keep him going for a short while. $5 billion would revive his company for good. Chapter 4. Faye saw the look of hesitation on Blake's face, and her expression darkened. "Think this through, Mr. Woods. We're very strict on Cape's financial supervision, and this is no exception. You've got your concerns, but so do we. If you don't want this, we can end our collaboration at once." Blake struggled for a while but agreed to sign in the end. The $5 billion were far too important. Furthermore, an establishment like the Cape Consortium would not go out of its way for a small company like Woods Corporate, right? "I'll sign it." Blake signed obediently in the end. Faye leaned back in her chair, swaying slightly with a smile. Upon signing, Faye stood up and extended a hand to Blake. "I look forward to working with you. Woods Corporate will receive the funds at once. Please check your transaction." Blake hurried to shake Faye's hand with great gratitude. Faye took her hand back with a smile. "Goodbye then." Blake nodded excitedly, bowing deeply before leaving the office to prepare for his upcoming tasks. Faye sat back down on her chair with a cold smile. Idiot. Evening came. Wilbur headed downstairs to have dinner outside. As he reached the living room, Jackson, Miranda, Yvonne, and Blake were chatting and laughing on the couch. Wilbur glanced at them and headed outside. Just then, Yvonne called out to him. Wilbur, what is it? He turned to ask. Yvonne was all smiles. Blake just got $5 billion from Cape Consortium. What does that have to do with me? Wilbur's expression was stony. Yvonne flared up in anger at once. This idiot was truly a pain in the neck. Wilbur, Blake's going to be staying over tonight in my room. Try not to come outside if there's nothing going on. I wouldn't want you to see anything you shouldn't be seeing, Yvonne said in a mocking tone as she clutched Blake's arm. Wilbur's expression darkened, casting a glance at everyone in the living room. However, his in-laws looked completely fine. Yvonne was all smiles, and Blake was nothing but arrogant. No one was embarrassed. They were only feeling one thing, and that was disdain and condescension toward Wilbur. A brief pause later, Wilbur let out a sigh. All right. I'm okay with it. Let's get divorced tomorrow. Yvonne was overjoyed. You'd better keep your promise. We're getting it done first thing tomorrow morning. You're leaving with nothing, Miranda tacked on as well. Wilbur smiled, shaking his head. Whatever you guys say. The Willows were overjoyed, and Blake was gleeful too. He had not only just gotten $5 billion, but the Willows would soon be his too. Just then, Chelsea came into the room. She saw the looks on everyone's faces and asked at once, What are you guys doing? Wilbur just agreed to get a divorce. Yvonne smiled. Chelsea was in shock, turning to look at Wilbur. Didn't you promise me? Silly girl. You can't force things like this. Let's just let this take its own course, Wilbur said with a smile. Chelsea stared at her parents in disbelief. Are you really going to go through with it? We've made up our minds. Keeping this lazy freeloader around will only stop your sister and the Willows from having a bright future. Things will be better with him out of the picture, Jackson said. Mom? Chelsea looked at her mother. Miranda put on a sincere facade and said, The Willows will have a better future if we join forces with Blake. We're doing this for your sister's happiness and our family's future. Please understand where we're coming from. How could you do this? Chelsea was truly enraged, roaring at them. She pointed a shaky finger at her parents and sister, tearing up. The Willows would be nowhere without Wilbur. Have you no conscience? Kicking him out just like that. What are you talking about? Jackson could hardly contain his rage, moving to slap her daughter immediately. The crisp sound rang through the air, and Chelsea clutched her face in a daze. She only returned to her senses a long time later. She had no more tears to cry, only a deep pang of pain in her chest. She glanced at her parents and shook her head. I can't stay in a family like this. Do whatever you want. Upon saying that, Chelsea left without turning back. Jackson seemed slightly remorseful, but Miranda said, Pay her no mind. She'll come back in a few days once she has thought things through. Wilbur frowned. I'm leaving. See you at the Department of Marital Affairs tomorrow. Having said that, he swaggered out. Miranda sneered coldly. I'll break his legs if he doesn't show up tomorrow. Jackson beamed and said, Mr. Woods, Mrs. Willow and I are going to get some rest. You can keep chatting with Yvonne. We won't be in your way. With that said, Jackson left with Miranda in tow, and the pair quickly returned to their room. Just then, Blake was all smiles as he carried Yvonne to her room. He got on top of her in bed and took off his clothes excitedly. Yvonne hurried to stop him. Not now. I'll be all yours once we're married. Blake did not force it either. All right. As long as that makes you happy, I'm fine with enduring a little longer. Oh, don't be like that. I'll be yours soon anyways. What's the rush? Say, when should the wedding be? Yvonne cooed. Within the next few days. I'll get it arranged the moment you divorce that bum, Blake said without hesitation. Yvonne lay on Blake's chest. I love you, Blake. I love you too, Yvonne. Yvonne's expression was filled with bliss, but Blake's gaze carried something a little more sinister. Upon leaving the Willows, Wilbur walked along the street as he sent Chelsea a text. He told her to calm down somewhere else for now and not to go anywhere in a hurry. Chelsea was not the strongest, But she was young and could be trained. Her principles and childlike innocence were what Wilbur liked most about her. People like that would be extremely useful to him in the future. Just like that, Wilbur strolled along the street slowly as he thought about what was to come. Soon enough, an entire hour had passed. Right then, a loud cry cut through the air. Wilbur turned to see a little kid around 4 or 5 years old in the middle of the street, and a car was getting closer by the second. The driver slammed the brakes, but the kid would still be in danger, considering the distance. Wilbur had made up his mind the moment he saw the scene. Chapter 5. He immediately stomped hard on the ground. The concrete beneath his foot cracked under the pressure as he shot out like a bolt of lightning to catch the kid. His toes tapped off the front of the car as he floated a few meters backward lightly and landed on the ground gently. All of that happened in the span of 2 seconds. Just as Wilbur put the kid down, the witnessing passers-by let out cries of disbelief. One woman rushed over upon crying out, pulling the child in for a hug and inspecting him for injuries. The driver had gotten out of the car as well. She made sure that the kid was all right before walking up to Wilbur. "It's you?" both of them said at the same time. Wilbur shrugged. "What a coincidence. I'm so sorry, boss. It's my fault for not paying attention. Are you all right?" Faye stood where she was, panicking. "I'm fine." Wilbur shook his head. He came up to the child and checked for injuries before turning to the child's mother. "Is everything all right?" Yes. Thank you so much. I was just paying at the store when this kid ran out on his own." The child's mother was in shock as well, stuttering as she spoke. Wilbur smiled. "I'm glad you're both fine." Just then, a crowd had gathered around in curiosity. That was because they could hardly believe what they had just seen. Wilbur noticed it and turned to Faye. "Let's go." Faye hurried to nod. Wilbur got into her car, and the pair left the scene. Faye was still worrying in the car. She looked in the rearview mirror to see Wilbur smoking silently while looking out of the window. Faye did not dare to say anything, and the pair kept quiet. A while later, Faye could not take it anymore and asked in a low voice, "Where are you going, boss?" "Oh." Wilbur seemed to have just snapped out of a daze and asked, "Could you help me find a place to stay?" "Do you need anything in particular?" Faye asked. Wilbur shook his head. "Nope. It just needs to be livable." "What about one of the company's properties?" "That will do." Faye nodded, then drove into a wealthy area before stopping in front of a bungalow. "This is the company property?" Wilbur asked in shock. Faye nodded. "Yes. Cape Consortium bought it." "You guys are really lavish with your money, huh?" Wilbur could not help but shake his head at the sight of the massive house in front of him. The houses lining the street were all mansions, and it was clear that this was a place of luxury. Faye's gaze glowed brightly and said, "Please come inside, boss." Wilbur followed Faye into the bungalow. The living room alone was over 200 square feet, complete with high-end furniture and artistic interior design. "Not bad," Wilbur could not help but say. They led Wilbur to the couch and served him a cup of coffee. Wilbur took a sip and frowned. "Can I get some tea instead?" "Sure thing, boss." Yvonne rushed to brew a mug of tea before bringing it over. Wilbur looked around him. "Why did the company buy this house?" Faye hurried to explain. "This is one of our investments. We've got 20 of these houses, but this is the only one that's furnished." "Oh, an investment. Well, I don't know much about that. I'll leave that up to you guys," Wilbur said after taking a sip of tea. Faye took the opportunity to sit next to him and said in a low voice, "This area has high investment value. The price has risen by 10% since we invested." "Not bad," Wilbur nodded. Faye continued, "The company furnished this place to house important guests, but I usually live here too." Faye stole a glance at Wilbur as she said that. He did not seem to care much as he nodded. "Multi-purpose. That's good." Faye finally heaved a sigh of relief. "What would you like to eat, boss? I'm a decent cook." "Oh, anything's fine. I'll eat whatever." Wilbur smiled lightly. Faye smiled. "I'll make you some pasta then." Wilbur nodded, and Faye got up to go upstairs. She entered her room and put a hand over her beating chest. Was she the luckiest girl in the world? She could hardly believe it. She was going to live with her boss. Were the heavens giving her a chance? After calming down, she took a deep breath and opened her closet. At last, she changed into a nightgown. The nightgown was not revealing but would show glimpses of skin as she moved. It was a rather seductive piece of clothing. After checking herself in the mirror, Faye bit her lip and went downstairs. She greeted Wilbur in the otherwise silent living room and went into the kitchen. The kitchen was completely transparent, and one could see everything going on in there from the living room clearly. Faye got to work in the kitchen, rinsing and chopping away. Wilbur caught a glance of Faye's back through the glass panel, and he smiled lightly. Not long after, Faye came out with a plate of pasta and placed it in front of Wilbur. As she bent down, she presented a good view of her bosom to Wilbur. Just then, Wilbur said all of a sudden, "There's something here." He then reached out toward Faye's chest.